This week's Parsha recounts the sin of Moshe Rabbeinu, an event that's ultimately beyond our ability to fully comprehend. Moshe was the greatest Navi, the greatest prophet who ever lived. And Chazal teach us that his level was far beyond our own. Nevertheless, the Torah records this episode because there's a lesson for us to learn from it. Hashem instructed Moshe Rabbeinu to speak to the rock and bring forth water for Klal Yisrael. Instead, Moshe strikes the rock. As a result, Moshe was denied entry into Eretz Yisrael. At a first glance, this is difficult to understand. Water doesn't normally come out of a rock. Whether Moshe spoke to the rock or struck it, a miracle was required anyway. Why was hitting the rock such a serious offense? And why did it warrant such a severe consequence? The question becomes even stronger when we remember an earlier episode. In Parshas B'Shalach, when Klal Yisrael complained about a lack of water shortly after leaving Mitzrayim, Hashem explicitly instructs Moshe to strike the rock. There, hitting the rock was exactly what he was supposed to do. Why was it appropriate then, but not now? I heard a beautiful explanation from Rav Moshe Weinberger Shlita. He says, the difference was not in the rock, it was in the generation. The generation that left Mitzrayim had grown up as slaves. They were raised in an environment of harshness, force, and oppression. That was the language they understood. Therefore, when Moshe struck the rock in Parshas B'Shalach, he was communicating in a manner that resonated with that generation. But 40 years later, in this week's Parsha, Parshas Chukas, a new generation stood before him. These were people who had been raised entirely in the desert. They had lived their whole lives surrounded by Hashem's care. They ate mon from Hashem, drank water from Miriam's well, and they were protected by the Ananei HaKavod. This generation requires a different language, a language of communication, understanding, and connection, rather than force. That's why Moshe's action was viewed so seriously. The issue was not merely whether the rock was struck or spoken to. The deeper issue was a leader has to know how to communicate with the generation standing in front of him. Every generation has its language, its own struggles, and its own needs. And perhaps the lesson for us is that successful leadership, educating, parenting, and relationships all depend on the same principle. Before we can influence people, we have to learn to speak their language. A high school principal noticed a student who had suddenly begun wearing a baseball cap every day in school, despite the rules forbidding it. The boy was a good boy, but he'd become withdrawn and defiant. Every teacher told him the same thing: take off the cap. He refused. Detentions followed. Suspensions were discussed. The situation became a battle. One day, the principal called the student into his office. The boy expected another lecture. Instead, the principal asked, "Can you tell me why the cap is so important to you?" The boy sat silently. After a long pause, he started to cry. A few weeks earlier, he began chemotherapy treatments. Most of his hair had fallen out. He was embarrassed for his classmates to see him. The cap wasn't an act of rebellion, it was a shield. The principal looked at him and said, "You can wear the cap." Years later, that student said, "That was the moment my life changed. Not because he got permission to wear the hat, but because for the very first time, an adult stopped trying to win the argument and started to try and understand him." Let's try to understand people. Our generation demands of it. Good Shabbos.
Enjoyed watching? There's a whole world waiting for you. Start exploring now. Visit today, www.rabbiwiesenfeld.com.